Well, welcome to the RECO12 Speaker Meeting Podcast. My name is Justin, and I am an addict, and thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I'm sober, one day at a time, since June 19th of 2015. And for that, I am beyond grateful. Welcome once again to the RECO12 Speaker Meeting. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust and sex, food and gambling, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom meeting each Friday at noon Central Time for about 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. In order to ask questions, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you are hearing this podcast recorded and would like to participate as a live audience member, or if you would like to be a guest speaker in a future meeting, please go to www.reco12.com, that's RECO12.com, and learn more and submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations or to submit to become a guest speaker in a future meeting. RECO12 is an ad-free service, and we appreciate your help in keeping it that way. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the costs of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to reco12.com/support, or you can click the link to PayPal in the chat here in the live meeting. And I'll get that there in a few minutes. When you contribute, please specify the meeting number. This is meeting number 20. Woohoo! We've got to number 20, and we're moving forward. It's a great thing. Grateful for that. Last week's meeting was with Patricia and Sid, a mother and son team who shared how addiction and the recovery process are both a family affair as they dealt with codependency and addiction to crystal meth. If you missed hearing that one or any other meeting we have done, you can listen to them in podcast form by searching for RECO12 Speaker Meeting Podcast on virtually any podcast platform that you use. Or you can go to the RECO12 website and find it there under the link podcast. Before we get started, I want to invite anybody listening in to this podcast to hit pause and go into your podcast app and rate and review this podcast. It helps get this message to more addicts who suffer. It is a simple way to work your step 12 today. Now let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Phil L. His talk is entitled Going from Self-Hatred to God's Love. Phil is a sexaholic who has been blessed with 5 years of sobriety. 5.5 years ago, he was introduced to true recovery and had a big spiritual awakening. He currently runs arpsupport.org and has been blessed to participate in the great camaraderie that exists with his fellow addicts of SAL and SA. Throughout his journey for long-term recovery, God has orchestrated every piece. God is the light. God is his light and has saved him from the awful hell he was in. Take it away, Phil. The floor is now yours.
All right. Thank you, Justin. I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to be able to share a small piece of my life and really to be able to show how God's work is a miracle in my life, that my life is a miracle. I'm already crying at the beginning of this, so hopefully I can get through this without crying a ton. But just to introduce a little bit more, I am a sexaholic, and I grew up in a great family with great parents who were very positive and uplifting and caring. When I was 12, we were moving to a new city, and we're in transition from one house to the next. And in that transition, I tried out for a soccer team. And this was the best soccer team in the state. And I loved soccer. It was my life. And I had just decided at that moment, just about a couple months before, that soccer was what I was going to do full time. And at that moment, I didn't make the top team, and I didn't even make their B team. And I remember feeling a little bit like that God didn't love me at that time, because it was something that I really, truly wanted. At this point, I remember going into a room. We had just barely gotten internet. And I remember going into the room to, I believe at the time, start on some homework. And I got onto the internet and had started looking up what I needed to look up. And a advertisement popped up. And all I remember at that moment is pure panic and the feeling of excitement that came along with that. And I clicked on it, and that began the change that has affected my entire life. I'm already crying. I remember clicking a few times and feeling so excited but scared, and that this was wrong. And I remember then closing out and running into my room. And the thing that I remember is specifically shame. I remember being taught growing up that I could go to God and that I could pray to Him, and that I could experience forgiveness for mistakes that I've made. The interesting thing is that after viewing pornography for that first time, all of the things that I had learned kind of went out the window. I remember feeling just shame, and that God couldn't help me with what I had just done. The thing that's also interesting is that at that time, I believe I was just a scared 12-year-old boy that had not been prepared for the world that addiction brings, and specifically the world that pornography brings. Kind of fast forward throughout my life, just about 6-7 months later, as I continued to periodically go back through and view pornography, I remember feeling this tearing apart of my soul. And I remember feeling that I was not going to be able to make it to live with God again. I remember feeling a complete shame. And so if I was going to be able to go through this life, really I needed to get rid of this addiction. But after I tried multiple times, and again, I'm 12 at this time, and I tried on my own, I kept failing. And so the only option that came to my mind was suicide. I remember sitting there and having this feeling of, that's the only way that I'm going to be able to escape this hell. For people who don't have an addiction, the emotions that you feel in your addiction are very, very deep. And at that point, that was the only thing that I could come up with to escape, because viewing pornography again and again, it stopped the feeling for a few seconds, and then it just come back deeper. So before I carried it out, I remember having a thought: if God's real, then that's a really dumb thing to do. So I went out back in our backyard. There's this little orchard that was back there, and I knelt down, and with the most pure form of prayer I could muster at that time, granted I was 12, I prayed just to know if God was real. And one of the things that I feel very blessed in my recovery is that I have no doubt that God's real. I won't go into too much detail of that experience, but needless to say, that experience was very, very powerful for me. However, that's what I found out, is that God is real. As I go throughout my life at that point and keep going, I remember continually feeling shame, but knowing that God's there. And as I learned more about God through religious classes and with my family, there was something that kept coming to mind, and that is that God is a just God, and that He brings down the hammer. And so when I would feel or hear about how I just needed to go to God, and that if I went to God, I would feel love, I could not bring myself to actually go to God because I was impure. These parts of my life, these parts of my decisions that I was making, and the lies that I was living, how could I go before God who is perfect? And so I began to hate myself more and more. I remember one specific moment where I had just acted out, and I was so mad. I was so mad at myself. I started swearing, and I'm not much of a swearer, so that was kind of a big deal for me, especially young. And I was so mad that I took a pen that had a metal endpoint, and I just started digging it into my hand, and digging it and digging it and digging it. And the reason was because I wanted to get rid of this impurity. I wanted to get rid of this. I wanted to get rid of this pain, and I hated myself. I can think of so many moments where after acting out, in the middle of acting out, before acting out, where I would start beating myself up. I would start punching myself. I'd start punching pillows. I'd start punching the ground. I'd start punching whatever I could, because I absolutely loathed the person that I was. A person who could not do what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do was to go out and play with friends. What I wanted to do is, when I was coaching soccer, was to just go to the place where to the field where I was coaching, just go out there on the field and coach the kids. Instead, it would go towards, I would spend 20 minutes, viewing pornography, because I could not control that, and be late to places. My life was out of control. So fast forward even further, I finally find a program after trying many, many programs. I finally find a program that helps me have some form of accountability, discipline, and gives me assignments and things that I can do to work the 12 steps. As I go through that program, step 2, which is recognizing essentially that a higher power exists, and that higher power is really what brings success. I was willing to accept the fact that there was a higher power, because I found that out earlier in my life, but I was not willing to bring myself wholeheartedly to this God that I didn't really truly know. And I remember sitting there at one point after completing the 12 steps, and knowing that God was powerful enough to help me, but having this battle that's going on inside of me that's saying, yeah, but you can't go to him because you're still impure. Now, I firmly believe that I had utilized the atonement. I firmly believe that I had gone to God and given him my actions and given him the things that I had done, and I had made amends with everybody around me, and I had done what I needed to do with the 12 steps. And then actually there was an individual who challenged me at one point. And the challenge that I got was, I can't believe in a God who has expectations. And I said, there's a part of me that just panicked, because I was like, no, God has expectations. He has high expectations of me. And that really bothered me. And we went back and forth on this discussion. And I decided at one point, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to give it a try. God doesn't have expectations of me. And there was an intense, incredible feeling of peace that happened when I started to see that God doesn't have these high expectations of me. And then I go to my church. We have a library of information, and one of the top leaders in the church has this talk, and the very first line is this: God is a God of high expectations. And I'm like, oh crap. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like again, this is pushing more and more into the fact that I am not reaching up to God's potential, or to the potential that God thinks that I can have. And that God has these high expectations of me. And I remember specifically this moment as I had just struggled with this concept. And I remember specifically this moment, and I had this thought one night while I was meditating, because mind you, at this point, I still did not have a connection with God other than I knew he existed. And that his power was powerful enough to at least make it so that I could be sober one more day. That's the extent of my power that I knew God had and my connection with him. And I remember this one time as I was meditating, because I was trying to meditate and to connect. And I remember specifically this thought. And the thought was, Phil, did you have high expectations of the boys that you coached? And I remember thinking, yeah, I had crazy high expectations of these boys, like super high. I was helping these boys compete at the highest level in the state. And so when practices came and I gave them homework and I gave them all these things that they needed to do, yeah, I had high expectations. And then probably one of the most powerful questions I've ever had came to my mind. And the question was, do you, sorry, even though you have high expectations of these boys, why do you have high expectations? And the thought came to me, an answer to that is because I see what they can become. I see the potential that they have. I see the skills that they can develop, and I see the type of impact that they can have on the world. And all of a sudden, the concept of expectation changed for me. So then the thought came, okay, Phil, what happened when they didn't reach your expectation? Because for any of you that have ever been a coach or have had coaches, you know full well that you do not live up to the expectations of your coach. So when that question was asked in my mind, I thought, well, what I did and what I wanted was to help them more. And again, just mind-blowing experience in my head, because it's like, oh my gosh, like how can I, like this is crazy. Because my response wasn't to push away from them and to just leave them there. My response was, I'm willing to do whatever the crap it takes to help them. And so I give them, I'd stay a little bit longer at practice. I'd sit with their parents and them and help teach them and give them a little extra time. And so then the thought came, well, what happened when you just got frustrated with the fact that they kept making the same mistake over and over and over? Because that happens. And the thought came, my assistant coach came and helped reminded me of how far they've come and that they were still worth my time. Now, finally, finally I could see a God. Finally, I could see a God that was okay with my impurities, that was okay with my mistakes, that was okay with my stupidity and my quirkiness and my weirdness. Finally, I could see a God who sets expectations for me, not because he knows I'm going to fail, but specifically because he sees where I can get to. And then because I fail or I make mistakes, he tries harder. He reaches farther. And then those times where I keep going, there's, we're going to get a little more spiritual here, but in my belief, I believe in Savior Jesus Christ. And he gets to go and advocate for me so that in my impurities, with my mistakes, with the parts that I absolutely hate about myself, I can still go into the presence of God and converse with him, because the Savior of the world advocates and says to God, look how far he's come, and he's still worth your time. Since realizing that and having that, I would put that in probably a top 3 most spiritual awakenings of my entire life. I finally feel like I can approach God. Mind you, this is 20 years later after my addiction started. I can finally approach God. I can finally say, here I am with my impurities. And man, am I glad that there's somebody there advocating for me, because God still has to be the judge. But because there's somebody advocating for me, he can allow me to still be there. And that's his love, is that he set this plan that way. Anyways, my journey to come to this is 21 years in the making. 21 years ago, I got attacked on the internet by an advertisement, not something that I had chosen or planned to have happen. It wasn't something I sought out, and it affected my life tremendously. However, my entire life has become better because of my addiction. I have gained a greater awareness and greater appreciation of what life has to bring because of my addiction and because of the necessity to go to a higher power. I guarantee if I didn't have this necessity in my life, I would not be trying to find God. I would not be trying to find a higher power. And I am grateful for that every day. The one thing that, and there's questions that are going to happen, but the one thing that I just want to put out there for anybody, number one, when you have those suicidal thoughts, I feel the pain, and that there is somebody else out there that does too. Second thing is that God is real and that he is there. It just takes time. Before I gained a connection with God, it was 21 years later after me committing or wanting to commit suicide and making that plan. 21 years. So hold on, search, be honest, and find other people who can understand what you're going through. When you do that, there's hope. And so just remember that there's always somebody out there. Okay? That's what I have to say.
Thanks, Phil. I really appreciate it. We'll get to questions here in just a minute. And man, good stuff. I love your story. I think that it resonates with a lot of people. Before we get to the questions and answers, and reminder to our live audience here, to type in a question for Phil, please do it in the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. It looks like 2 speech bubbles, and we'll get to those. But Phil, if you wouldn't mind taking just a minute here and kind of sharing a little bit about the fellowships that you attend and how they help you in your own journey in recovery.
Yeah, I would love to. I remember early on in my recovery, I was actually sitting in Vegas on my anniversary, and I was reading. It's called "Sitting in a Rowboat, Throwing Marbles at a Battleship." I was reading that, and I remember I remember seeing a road in front of me, and it split off into 2 opposite directions. And I remember that if I took one more step to the left, I was never coming back to the right until I lost everything. And so at that point, I made a decision, and I said, okay, what is the one thing that I will not do? What is the one thing that I just have said I am not willing to do? And that was to go to Sexaholics Anonymous. The reason I wasn't going to do that was because that was the worst of the worst. That was where all the perverts went, and that's where all the people who, were horrible individuals went. And so I said, fine, I will go to that. And the thing that I found is that is not where the perverts went. That is not where the worst people went. That was where the best people went. That is where the people who can understand what I feel, the people who could understand the pull that I feel to act out. That's where those people were. And that's where my first experience was with people that I would consider saviors in my life. And from there, I told the moderator, I said, the guy who runs the meeting, I said, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just tell me what I've got to do. And he said, well, if you if you're willing to do whatever, go to arpsupport.org and go through their program too. So I said, okay. I went home that night, signed up for ARP support. I got a sponsor through ARP support, and immediately within the next 3 days, I was being told that if I needed to write my journal first thing in the morning, write my journal the last thing of the day, I needed to do my step work first thing in the morning. And if I didn't make my weekly phone call with my sponsor, that I was going to be done with the program. And I remember because I had gotten to that point where I said, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. If ARP support or if SA were to tell me, look, in order to stay sober, you need to go outside at 5:23 p.m. and you need to do 4 cartwheels, 5 push-ups, 4 somersaults, 32 sprints, and jump up and down 5 times and do 3 360s. At 5:23 p.m., if you do that every day, you'll be sober. That I was going to make sure that was going to happen because I was willing to do whatever it took to stay sober. And so fast forward 3.5 years later of sobriety, because I never acted out again after that moment. 3.5 years later, I was asked to run ARP support, and that was almost 2 years ago. And so I've been running ARP support and sponsoring within ARP support for almost the last 2 years.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Phil. I appreciate it. And I know many people, myself included, who are products of that ARP support. And it's been a huge blessing in my life and in the lives of many. I appreciate you taking that and running with it. Anyways, now it's time for our guest speaker to answer your questions. Once again, to ask any questions, type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get to that. We'll start off here with a question that I have for you, Phil. Would you like to expound a little bit on, you talked about God being a God of justice, dropping the hammer. And you talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but I'd like you to dig a little bit deeper maybe and talk about the justice versus the mercy of God and how you reconcile that in your own walk and in your own recovery.
Whew, that's a big question. So just growing up in my faith and in my family, I you do it because I say, you do it because because that's the rule, and if you don't do it, there's consequences. And so I grew up with a loving mother and father, but that was also the rules. And so I grew up with my understanding of a powerful individual as somebody who, if you don't follow what the family rules are, then there's consequences. And so in my mind, I overlaid that onto God. So when I read, for example, don't look upon a woman to lust after her. When I read that and then that happens, there's consequences. And so I always felt that because God is in this position where he has to uphold the law. He has to uphold the law, that he's going to drop the hammer on me because I viewed pornography, and because I kept going back to it. And so my upbringing definitely influenced that. And how I've learned that God is also a God of mercy, because God still, he still has to, he still gets angry with people, and he still gets angry with situations. And how I reconcile that is actually in the plan that I believe that he has for each one of us, which is to allow the Savior to, Jesus Christ, to come into our lives and to ultimately be the one that pleads for me. And in that wisdom of God is his mercy, and allowing him to still be able to bless me with peace, bless me with sobriety, bless me with the ability to move forward when I've felt stuck. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Phil. I appreciate your perspective and your experience on that. For me, I am grateful that I am learning something new almost all the time in my recovery walk. When I first started this, I thought, when I get 3 years sober, 5 years sober, I'll have it all figured out and be able to, just rock the world with people and tell them exactly how it is. But I'm grateful that, I fall on my face time after time and find something new that just blows my mind. You mentioned, as you were talking, you talked about this experience of figuring out who God really is in your life, who that higher power is, and how that works. How far into your sobriety did that happen? And tell me a little bit about that process and how that awakening happened.
Yeah. So July 10th, 2015 is what I claim as my sobriety date. That was my awakening. Fast forward to, what is it? It's September of 2020. So 2 months ago. That's when I had that experience that I shared in my story. So over 5 months or 5 years into recovery is the first time that I have I've gained it. I believe it's the first time I've gained a relationship with God. And one of the things that I always tell people, and I always work with people on, is that uh, there's a natural process to learning. Learning is not something that just happens just automatically. It's not something that just happens when I want it. I can try and set up the environment to allow for learning to happen, um, as quickly as possible, but there's still a piece inside me that has to allow the learning to happen. And for me, in my recovery, learning is a long process. It's a long-term process. And so I don't just come to these conclusions in just a small, quick moment. These conclusions come with months and years of struggle and trying to figure out and to learn. And then finally, there's external circumstances that help shape to get me to that point where I am finally willing to, the way I describe it is willing to listen. And when I'm finally willing to listen, that's when learning happens for me. And so 5 years, 5 years into sobriety, and I had been searching and praying to God since I was 12 and trying to connect with God. So ultimately, if you go from the time that I started acting out, it took me 21 years to finally get a connection with God. That's a long time to not have a connection with God.
Yeah, and my story is fairly similar with that until I all of a sudden went, I think I see God more clearly than I ever have, and now have that ability to recognize His voice and His influence in my life that much more, and that's really cool. Thank you for sharing that, Phil. Kind of skipping a little bit here and jumping into a different topic of recovery. In what step of recovery do you think you currently live? What step kind of motivates you each day the most of any of the others?
Because of ARP support, I've lived in step 10 for probably the last 5 years. However, there's a transition that is happening, and that is that I'm starting to live more so in step 2. Step 2, step 1, and step 3. Step 10, 11, 12 are really important for the towards me to have the actions and things that I need to do in order to remain sober. But where I'm learning to live, which I think is the important piece to your question, where I'm learning to live is in step 2. I think step 1, I understand that I am powerless and that I am not capable of doing this. I have 21 years of examples, of always failing. However, step 2 and step 3, where I recognize and actually start to have a connection with God. And then once I recognize that I have a connection with God and that I'm willing to carry out something that I hear from that God connection, that's where I'm trying to live.
Well, that's very
steps 2 and 3.
That's awesome. That's very interesting. I just kind of made a connection in my own mind, and I'm big on this talking about letter of the law versus spirit of the law. And I think, working through the steps initially, I have to do it letter of the law style. I have to. And I have to learn that letter of the law, 10, 11, 12, once I get to that and really apply it. And then I think there's a reawakening in me to bring it back to the spirit of the law, which is, the deeper law there. And that's kind of a cool awakening that's happening in my own life. Is there anything else, Phil, that you want to talk about in regards to purity, impurity? Any other thoughts you have on that?
Yeah. So the way that I perceived myself was that I was an impure person. Every time I acted out, I became more impure. And not just that, but there's other characteristics about my life that I I would still stamp as impure. Like, for example, if I made a decision or I made a goal to not eat sugar. Let's say that one. This is a great one for me every day, that I make this goal to not eat sugar. Yet I drive to work and I go past a gas station and I go, you know what? I really want a king size candy bar. So then I pull over and I go and I buy 2 king size candy bars and I eat those. That's an impurity to me, is that there's these characteristics, these flaws in if I were to if I were to perceive myself as a perfect person, there's these impurities and these flaws. And so the part that I always thought I had to do before being able to connect with God was that I had to come to God with the purest part of myself. And to be honest, I very rarely was even paying attention to that purest part of myself, because everybody has that purest part. But for me and my addiction, I lived majority of the time, and still do, in that impure part of my life. And that what I found is that 2 things. One is that if I'm going to be completely honest, which is required for recovery, I have to lead with the impure parts of myself, which means I have to go in front of a God who is perfect. I have to be impure. I have to bring that impure part so that God can continue to shape and change me to become different, to become somebody who is growing in my application of my connection with God, and my application of applying that to other people around me. And so as that's one thing. And then the second thing with impurity is that other people want, the thing when I think about the people that I care about the most and the people that have made the greatest impact on my life, they are not the people who are showing me the pure form of themselves. The people who make the greatest impact on me are the people who show the impure parts of themselves. Because what happens is that I can, at that point, connect with another human being, because that part of impurity, I believe, is required for connection, which is why the greatest connection I have to this day is with my addict brothers. The people who I can be completely blunt and honest and show my impurities to. They're the ones that I have the greatest connection with, because I show those regardless, because I don't care of the outcome. And so the impurities, I believe, and I use the word impurity because I think that's how, I know that's how I perceived myself, was an impure person. And so I use the word impurity because I think it's important to identify that for those of us that grew up in a very Christian home, I think the term impurity, it creates a visceral response. And so that's what I've learned about impurity and its role in my connection with God and other people.
I love that. Impurity is necessary for connection. And I think that impurity kind of goes along with vulnerability that adds that connection. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. All right. So, Phil, before we close up here, do you have any final words of wisdom before we get into the closing spiel and a prayer to send us off into the rest of the day?
Yes. The thing that I always tell people is that you are a unique individual and you are a unique person. You have unique capabilities. You have unique experiences that have shaped you to become a different person that is unlike anybody else in this world. That is the person that I need. that is the person that the people around you need. We all need that impure, imperfect, unique person with your experiences, because every single time I talk to somebody, their experience and their weirdness and the way that they see the world changes the way that I see, which deepens my recovery and deepens my ability to grow. And so I guess selfishly, I need everybody. And so no matter what, no matter if you feel the intense desire to commit suicide, the intense desire to do something drastic, just remember, we need you. And that's something that I cannot emphasize enough, because the amount of people that have affected my life, and in turn, I've been able to show God's power in my life. Yeah, there's things that I don't like about myself, but guess what? That's the thing that connects with other people. So those are my last words.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. Those are some good last words, and I appreciate it. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If you have other questions, please go to RECO12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer others' questions that will come up there. I think that's a good place to share those vulnerabilities, those impurities, and get that connection there. That's one of the many places we can do that. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you have not yet gone to RECO12.com and submitted your email address, remember you only need to do it once. Please get on the invitation list so that you can join us live each Friday at noon Central Time. Next week's speaker meeting is, this guy's a firecracker. His name is Damon, and he speaks to college football teams and big programs about influencing others, kind of in this way that Phil talked about, with vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And he's a recovering addict, and he is a firecracker. Do not miss next week. It's going to be a good one. Now, to send us off into the day, Phil has asked me to say the third step prayer to get us going. Please join me in that as I say that. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Amen. Keep coming back, everybody. It works when you work it, so work it. You are worth it. Have a great one. Thanks again, Phil.
Reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine.